empty cars underneath and then load them ahead as they went. Now here again is another, that isn't the same big load I wanted to show you before, but that other one was all big logs. Now this is a mixture of different logs. Now here's, like I say, there was many different kinds of log loaders. About at least 4 or 5 different companies made different varieties of it. There's another different variety. Now this looks like pulp or else maybe fence posts or something. They also would cut long timbers for highline poles and timbers for bridge that would be squared off in the mill and stuff like that. Here's some that I don't know if it's peeled or not. It almost looks like they are peeled already. Now here's a load of fence posts going out. You know, when they were opening up the farms out west there, they probably sold thousands and thousands of fence posts. Now, this company here was in Wisconsin, and they always had a tank car. These two are water tank cars, and part of it was some of the equipment they had in the woods was steam engines, and they'd have to water it, get water in it so they could run. But they also used them. They had hoses on it in case they'd have a forest fire, which was not unusual. And of course they had to load their own main engine too with water someplace along the line. So they'd fill these up at a creek or a lake, and then they'd take it out to load the equipment in the woods. Now here's just shows us, this was down near Minocqua. I think it was or maybe it was Hazelhurst, but I think it was Hazelhurst. And they cut quite a bit of stuff to the south of Minocqua, and they had a mill in Hazelhurst. And this was, I can't remember again the name. Yaki Bissell had a mill. Now here's an engine somehow or other got tipped over. Like I say, it was a big major job to get it back up, but they were able by, I don't have a picture of them actually doing it, I don't think, but here's another, somebody got parked in the wrong place and a tree went down right across the engine, and that probably was worse than tipping the engine over because they maybe busted some of the water tank or whatever was, or the steam tank part of it. Now Brooks and Ross had a great number of camps going at the same time from, like I say, roughly from Boulder Junction north up into Upper Michigan a little ways. And each camp had a foreman, but they also had one foreman was the head of all the foremans, and he'd visit every camp. I don't know if he visited every day, but quite often he'd be checking to make sure that things were going right, one thing and another. But he always had a helper, and then instead of having to be in a camp where they had a place to turn around, they just had this little rig that would sit on the rail, and then they put a jack on it, and then they were able to lift up the car and turn it to get back out. Now, of course, they did a lot of their logging in the wintertime, and of course they had to have snow plows to keep the tracks clean, especially the main line. Sometimes on the side camps, they'd wait until spring before they took the stuff out. But here's where they had, it wasn't in Vilas County, this was someplace else, and one engine went up to clean the road and got stuck, and then they had most of the main lines had a telegraph line alongside the road, and I suppose they had equipment they could hook up to it to send for help to help get them out. Now this is just a picture in Boulder Junction. You can see the tops of the buildings in the background there, and of course the railroad would plow the road as long as they could, but eventually they couldn't push the snow out anymore because it was too high. They couldn't come too fast enough, and so they had to hire men to shovel the stuff out just in the town part. After they got out of town, then they could go a lot faster, and of course they threw it out a little further. Now here's one of the Weiniger and the Fosterville, of course, are all the same mill. Now a lot of these pictures are the same ones that you've seen over there before. Now there's where it's called Fosterville. But it was the standard mill. I mean, apparently they had equipment in this size mill that Fosterville had, and Winchester and Arborvita. they could get, once the mill was done, they could move it on to another, way in the background, you can see the ramp that would take the logs up to the second story to get sawed into boards and then and stuff. Now here's the Buswell mill. It was roughly the same size as far as the mill, but here they dumped the log. They had a railroad grade. The railroad grade was the Milwaukee Road. Of course, he had his own engines too. They'd run the flat cars with the logs on it out onto this platform, because Papoose Lake is right down here in the corner. And then they dumped the logs into the water, and then of course it was just a short ways over to get them over to the ramp up to the top of the mill. Now here's the steam engine in Winchester. I'm pretty sure it was Winchester. Shows the size of the engine and stuff that would run the main saws for cutting logs. And this man shows up. There was another picture I had. I don't know if, maybe I don't have it on this reel here. Showed him as a real young man, but apparently he was with the mill all the time the mill was there and ran that part. And this was the belt that would run the saws that would make the logs into boards. Now here's the crew and the hot pond. Some of the companies, so they could run all winter, they'd have a steam line going out into the water to keep the water from freezing. But a lot of the a lot of the year they didn't need that, but they'd get logs put into the mill pond, and then they'd go up this thing to go up to the upper mill. Here you can see a better picture of it going up. Now this isn't at Presque Isle, this is another mill somewhere. But the men would line up the log, and then all they had to do was get it started, and then it would catch and pull up, and then there'd be a cleat on the back end of it too. Now here's a regular big saw, not a band saw, but a big saw to make the boards. And I think the next bill here is they'd run it sometimes where they'd have gang saw. Now this one would be only one board at a time, but this is Yaki Bissell again down at Hazelhurst, and shows sharpening the saw blade. Now here's a bandsaw showing up, and this would usually it was 3/4 inch, occasionally an inch diameter. They could set it, I guess, for most any size. Now, well, within reason, any size they needed for the thickness of the boards. Here's a mill. I'm not even sure, but it's getting ready to go into a bandsaw off to the right. Now here's a Winchester mill. A lot of my pictures are Winchester and Presque Isle because that's where I was able to get pictures from. Here, this is, I think your mill here is, the lumber would eventually slide beyond the bandsaws. It would slide down to where they could load them on these carts, and then the horses would bring the carts over, and then they'd sort it by size so that when a lot of the stuff was air dried in these early years. Later on they had mills where they could dry it with steam and stuff, or hot air, but they piled it up real high, and it'd be there for a year or so before they with spacers in between, and then it would take a long time to dry. Now here's Weiniger. The other one probably wasn't Weiniger. Now eventually they'd sell the dried lumber. They sold green lumber too, but they'd sell the dried lumber, and it would go out by railroad cars, and they'd have to put it in by hand. I guess they'd carry it in and load it there. Early on, a lot of the mills that were along the Mississippi River and even the Wisconsin River, they actually sawed stuff into lumber and then they made rafts out of it and sent it downstream to where there was more people where they could sell it to and stuff. They'd make rafts. They'd have these. I can never remember the stakes that are sticking out. They'd have farmers would make it where they'd have where it went into the ground where it got wider, so they could pound these stakes in from the bottom and get the first set of boards, put them on, and then later on the rest of the boards they had holes in there, and they just fit the boards on to make the rafts. Now these are the pigs that they'd buy from farmers, and some of them they had a mill down to the right size and to do it. Now here's a raft going down the Wisconsin River, and most of the river was fairly smooth. Now the man in back, he's got a big, they call them wings, and they weren't there to, the current of the river furnished to move the rafts, but as they went around islands and curves and stuff, they had to have ways of getting the raft to follow the current and stuff, and so they'd have 2 or 3 of these big wings, or whatever they call them, on it, and so that they could get down to the level parts of the river again. Now, in the Wisconsin River, where Wisconsin Dells is, they would have these long rafts hooked together, and when they got to the actual Wisconsin Dells, they'd have to break it up so that they could get through the curves and stuff in this area. Here it shows it going down a little better, and here's one shows how much it wasn't really particularly dangerous, but expect accidents happened. But they had to break them apart, but they actually bent. The rafts would bend at each one of these sections because they were hooked together with the boards on top. And here, it's not a very good picture because it was too far over from the side. I mean, you can see a man on the front of one of the rafts with holding the wings up to keep them catching in the water. They actually were on the river for 2 or 3 days, especially on the Mississippi, where they were going down to Illinois and Iowa. And so they'd rig up little shelters for the men to sleep on, and they ate sometimes they ate right on the raft, and sometimes they'd park on the side and eat their meals. But apparently in the morning when they were waiting for breakfast, they'd bring out their blankets and stuff, and it was probably pretty cool or something, and it was a little colder. Here's the cook that's on this Wisconsin River. The young fellow in the background, Kingsbury, was one of the men that took photographs from camp to camp, and he also went down on the raft to take pictures. And that's his son in the background. And then he hired on as the help for the cook. He'd peel the potatoes and do the dishes and things like that. And so he at least had the experience of working for a few weeks or months, or maybe he did it more often, I don't know. But anyways, Kingsbury just wanted the pictures. Here's back at the Dells where they either anchored on the side, or yeah, I think so, or else they had a place that they could eat alongside of it. And here's where they were doing dishes afterwards. Now here's when they were still drinking water out of the Wisconsin River. I don't know if a guy would want to do it nowadays anymore with the pollution and stuff we have, but apparently it was good enough, or at least they lived through it for a while. And once in a while they get stuck on this, they tie up at night because there was no real practical way for them to watch for the bends and stuff. And actually they'd have this is a lumber raft, and then on top of the lumber raft, sometimes they'd pile shingles, and all of us older people remember what laths were. They were little strips about an inch or so wide and only an eighth of an inch or less thick. And they were put on 2x4s in the houses, and then they put plaster on it, and they would hold the plaster. And so they sold all kinds of laths. And this was always a deck load that they could sell along the way. Now here show them making rafts at, this is at Winchester that they were making. I assume Presque Isle had a lath mill too, but I'm not sure. And where they cut a lot of hardwood, where they made boards was fine, but where they had pieces left over, or some of the smaller diameters, they'd make handles for rakes and axes and all that kind of things that they were able to sell. Now here's a shingle mill down in Arborvita, and just a load of shingles that were, because a lot of people at the very least had shingle roofs, and of course a lot of houses